Hello, everyone. In this screencast, I am going to be overviewing the podcast activity titled I Just Want You to Come Home. So again, talking about last week, we overviewed the issues we've encountered with juvenile justice from an objective standpoint, looking at the general trends, statistics, and facts, but now we're looking at individuals' personal experiences within the juvenile justice system. So this first one is a podcast, and it's a pretty interesting one. It has this whole series. This is the very first one in the series in which we get introduced to this individual named Z to keep his anonymity. But we are seeing him when he's 16, listening to him when he's 16 years old. And we find through the podcast that his first experiences within the juvenile justice system occurred when he was first 12 years old. And if you remember, that's what we call recidivism, right? That revolving door effect where he was about seventh grade. He got in trouble in front of his school. You'll find that in the podcast, his school was right next door to the local police department. So there were a lot of instances. He grew up in a socioeconomically disadvantaged community. He identifies as African American. So keep that in mind while you're listening to this and relating it to some of the trends that we talked about within the juvenile justice system, especially around those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged and those who are colored, and what some of the realities are for these individuals. So in order to listen to it, you're going to click this play button here. The audio player for the podcast is embedded within Schoology. And to complete the activity, you're going to click on this link here, which will force you to make a copy. So when you click on it, your document will look like this. I've included some essential questions I would like you to keep in mind while you listen to this podcast. And a lot of it has to do with what we've been discussing throughout this unit. What does society, specifically American society, owe these juveniles who have been incarcerated in the juvenile justice system once we decide that they are a criminal? Do we owe them anything? How should we try them differently? What should we consider in terms of how we punish them or how we ultimately try to rehabilitate them? Because remember, that's our goal of juvenile justice, right? We're not trying to remove them from society and Control-Alt-Delete, right? But instead, we're trying to quote unquote fix the issue and bring them back into society so that they can contribute as law-abiding citizens. Also, for the second question, I would like you to consider what are some of the human consequences of the expansion and hardening of the criminal justice policies that began in the 1990s. If you remember from last week's lecture, during the late 80s and the early to mid 90s, America really started to crack down on juvenile crime because there was that huge spike, right? A lot of it had to do with drug use surrounding on the war on drugs, but that pendulum swing where we as in the United States thought we were being too lenient on juvenile crime. If juvenile crime's spiking, what can we do? So we swung the pendulum the other way and we cracked down really hard because as a nation, we were afraid that if we didn't nip this issue in the bud, these juvenile delinquents will grow up to be adult criminals and that this issue will just get bigger, and snowball. So we really cracked down hard. Underneath this is a summary of the podcast. So like I said, Z, our anonymous individual, is 16 years of age. He's sitting in a detention center. He's charged with armed robbery, but this isn't his first time. His very first experience was when he was 12 years old, only in 7th grade. So, and before you listen to the podcast, however, I would like you to define these terms. We'll be going over these in this week's lecture. But one of the biggest ones is this one on the top, super predator. This has a lot of strong connotations in terms of race specifically, and this term was introduced in the 1990s in the wake of that hard crackdown on juvenile crime. So I would like you to define those terms first, and then as you listen to the podcast, I would like you to answer these questions. You'll see here on the left, it gives you a timestamp of when to pause. So as you're listening, you'll pause it at 2:40, answer the question, and then resume. So each one has a timestamp for when that answer can be, or that question can be answered. So you'll go through and answer that. And then at the very end, I would like you to reflect on the final ruling of Z's case. So at the end of the podcast, Z mentions that during his trial, the judge said, "I'm under no illusion that sending you to prison will help." Remember, this ties back to those three main reasons why we established the juvenile justice system in the first place. We know that juveniles are fundamentally different than adults, cognitively, physically, and behaviorally. We also know that our ultimate goal is to rehabilitate them and prevent recidivism. So those are the other two reasons. If we put them in prison for life, there's no chance for them to be rehabilitated. And remember, at this point, when this case happened, the juveniles could go away for life without parole because the Supreme Court case hadn't been passed yet. But the judge says, "I'm under no illusion that sending you to prison to help." However, the judge flips and ultimately sentenced Z to 9 years in prison. So if you're 16, 9 years are coming out at 25. You're no longer a juvenile once you come out, right? If the human brain matures at the age of 25, what are your reactions to this, right? So his final years, or 9, almost a decade, of his brain maturity development occurs within prison. So I want to ask you, why do you think the judge decided to sentence Z to prison, even though he expressly acknowledged it would not help? 9 years, it's not like a year. Lionel Tate only got 6 months for killing someone, right? Armed robbery, 9 years in prison, even though the judge recognizes that prison isn't the answer, ultimately that rehabilitation is. I also want to bring your attention to that. Do you believe the narrative created about Black youth in the 1990s played a role in the judge's decision? And that narrative is going to tie back to this term super predator that you're going to define, because you're going to see that it is a very racially charged term. It's very controversial nowadays, and it almost explicitly identifies Black youth for being super predators and having this lethal potential in their future. So this is an interesting podcast. It's the first in the series, and if you like it, I highly encourage you to keep listening to it. And you can get the link to the podcast series by clicking this arrow here. And then when you're done with your activity, you're going to go ahead and submit it to Schoology. Thanks.